shows the infrastructure. That's right.
Yes, I don't know if I was just we're getting ready. Yes, Cal started a new live stream. The original one. So I wonder when that. No, that was not. I just dropped myself.
Cannot handle the resolution.
I think it was during the break because I didn't grab this chair, so there's yeah. So what I was saying.
You got my hand. That's the exact purpose of that chair. Actually, that's my workstation these days when everyone is in town.
It's pretty awesome. Can't tell if you're joking or not. Everybody thinks he's joking when he talks about this chair. He loves this chair.
How do you
use it? You set it on the ground and you sit on it. It's such a weird chair.
That's just ground level seating. Yeah, basically the aesthetic here is like
nice?
Japanese.
Okay.
It's kind of like having your feet up, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, you force everybody to sit in at once, and that's.
Jason, you failed a culture test because you did not like.
I didn't like the floor chair, and so I'm out for this. Now I kind of wish this couch should lower down. Can you do this? No. Look at that. Can you do that?
Very zen. What is the zen?
Message.
I don't know how to use a Mac. So I always get like super anxious when I like have to give a presentation because it's like I don't know any of the shortcuts on this. I plug in a keyboard, I switch Control and Command to the Windows one, and I use a mouse. Hi. Oh, it's like mirrored. That's weird. Okay, so this is a little talk about building a DOM reconciler. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare this. Thank you, Colin. So I think it's a mix of things. It's kind of a bit of how React DOM works, where a lot of the code is, and then kind of balanced, or maybe the counterpoint to a project I've been working on in my spare time called React DOM Lite. I hope there are a lot of questions about stuff. I think it's a good starting point to figuring out where there are like various size and performance gains to be had, and what with React bundles, as well as what the cost of all of the various kind of like things that are in React DOM, like what the cost of those things is, and maybe some amount of knowledge about what it's doing that you might not know. So this is building a DOM reconciler, or why do you hate yourself? I think so. So if you do web development sort of just as a job where you build websites or build web apps, you probably don't run into a lot of cross-browser stuff anymore. It's certainly a lot less horrible than it used to be. So we get a lot of this kind of like, I don't even understand why this is difficult. Cross-browser DOM stuff doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's all the same. And I really wish that was true. So I figured it's a good time to like sort of start with what React DOM doesn't do. So what the package React does versus what React DOM does. So what React DOM doesn't do is it doesn't handle propagating context through your React components. It doesn't figure out which components need re-rendering. It doesn't handle like the reason you need to add a key prop to children in an array so that it can handle like reordering them. It doesn't do any of that. React does that. It doesn't handle component lifecycles. So it's not the thing that's calling component will update or component did update. It doesn't have really much to say about fragments. And sort of related to that is it doesn't really have anything to say about JSX or React elements, the sort of underlying sort of abstraction over a React component, which is not maybe intuitive. What it does do is it figures out how to map React elements to DOM entities. It provides input back to React, so when to update, when components change, something like that via the event system. It implements things like controlled inputs. So like on change in value on a React DOM input is kind of very different than how it works. The same input works natively, where you get a change event on type and you have to feed the value right back into it, and the value will always be what you pass in as the prop, right? There's always this kind of declarative, this is the value. React DOM handles kind of implementing those bits. It also handles hydration. So if you server rendered something and you need to turn that back into a functioning web app, React DOM is the thing that actually does that, more or less. So the big sort of like work that most people think of when they think about React DOM is this part of it. It's taking React elements, or that abstract object that is just sort of a type, props, and that's kind of it, and turning that into something you see on a website. React do, that's not a thing. Which React DOM has to turn into something meaningful in the DOM, right? So like we have this abstraction, it's a description of a component tree, and React DOM has to give that meaning. Generally, we think of this as kind of React DOM, or in the DOM world, props map neatly to HTML attributes, or maybe properties, and JSX, which looks a lot like HTML, I think that similarity is misleadingly simple. Behind the scenes, nothing maps as neatly as you would hope or think. There's this kind of like perception, you write JSX, it looks like HTML. All I have to do is sort of map a few little different things, and there I go, I have HTML, we just put that in the web page. Actually, see, like this is a like, oh good, it started at the slide I was on. PowerPoint doesn't do that. I've been a web developer for almost 10 years, and there's a bunch of distinctions in here that I had no idea. Like I don't think like you sort of intuit some of it, but like I had never realized that any of these were like spec differences in a thing, like in the way that the way that JavaScript interacts with the DOM. It's not even HTML. It's really HTML and JavaScript. There's a property and an attribute, right? An attribute is the thing actually on the markdown. So HTML has attributes, like HTML tags have attributes, and those are interpreted one way into the document object model. And in JavaScript, we have properties, which sort of map to attributes. And then there's also properties or props starting with on or neither. They're event handlers. Remembering some of my notes on this. So this is like where it starts to get really messy. I don't know if like you've realized, I didn't really kind of understand these like idiosyncrasies. If you have a DOM, like in JavaScript, if you have a reference to an input or a DOM node and you set class name on it, you'll add the class name equals foo. You'll add the CSS class foo to that element. If you look at the sort of HTML representation in the dev tools, you'll see that that's reflected in it, right? You'll see class name or class now has foo on the element. If you set value, that won't happen. So some attributes sync with some properties sync with their attributes and some don't. So like you render an input, it has value equals foo, and then you grab a reference to that and you change it in JavaScript. The attribute value will still be the original thing that you had when you rendered it. Even though the property dot value will be something completely different at this point. So there's that. There's also really like fun. We see we've gotten a lot of the little props API things for DOM. So we have class name instead of class because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so class name works better. So class name is the JavaScript API. Class is the attribute API. Those are the easy ones. Things like content editable, that's all underscoring HTML, and then content editable camel case in JavaScript. Why? I don't know. Because most of the time it's like you can just sort of do camel case dash case or something to it, right? Like some of them, not so much. SVG, all attributes, no properties. None of them are consistently named. Half of them have dashes in them, and the other half just don't. Some of them are camel cased. I don't like. Also, to edit them, like the API for doing them. So, like for changing attributes, you've probably used, if you ever use like get at, like it's the element dot get attribute or has attribute or set attribute. SVG attributes are all namespace, so you have to provide a namespace for it, which means you need to track where in the tree you are and whether you're in some sort of namespaced object in order to set those. And you can make that complicated by going in and out by having an object SVG, HTML, another SVG tag. So you need to keep track of where you are because you can't just, like if you are walking down the tree and trying to turn props into attributes, you need to know what namespace you're supposed to be using for it. Otherwise, it just won't work. Or more probably in HTML, it'll work and then just be broken later. Yeah. So that is all set up to how like the React DOM, and then how I'm going to show code for React DOM Lite, how it sort of like handles this, just to sort of set up how complicated the problem actually is. Like it should be a simple matter of like, here's your props object, map over it, and set that on the DOM element. But it doesn't. So the reconciler gives you kind of like these three hooks for doing stuff. You have create instance, which is where you actually sort of get the type. So div, and you do document.create. Create element, you get a div, and you pass it back. You get prepare update. Oh, I love the consistent casing here. Which is a hook where I don't actually understand all of the reconciler like phases, but they're split into phases where you can figure out what to do and then we actually do the work. So prepare update is an opportunity to figure that's where all the like scheduling is happening, right? Commit update is when we get that change set that we made in prepare update and we actually push it or flush it to the DOM. So, can anyone even read this? This is very small.
I can tell you text on the screen. Okay, yellow text.
Jeez, man.
You're going to command plus. Keep going. Keep going. Maybe one more. Legible. Good enough.
The one moment where the TV has a better resolution than my it's nice. So this is React DOM Lite. I'm picking this not to hype the project here, though you should try it because I would love to know what breaks. But it's using the React Reconciler API, which is an API that React exposes. It's a package that the React exposes for sort of exposing a bunch of hooks for attaching a host environment to React. So both React DOM and React Native are now written in terms of this package. I'm showing this one because it gives kind of a pure example of like what hooks you might use. There's a ton of hooks in here that I like exist for the sake of React DOM and React Native and the sort of existing infrastructure that how they were already built. So create instance, where we do a bunch of create element, create element just calls the document.create element. You can see that if we're in an SVG context, I got to create it with the SVG namespace, and I have to track whether we're in an SVG context through some of these other hooks where it's giving me a container. I have to check like, okay, this is an SVG element, so now everything below this is in an SVG, unless we hit a foreign object. Then we're going to switch back to HTML. The same would be true for like MathML, but I don't know what that is. But React DOM supports it. So this is the interesting work. Prepare update where you get your DOM element that you've already created, the type, old props and new props, right? So that's got everything you need to understand what the change set would be from the last element to the next one. Diff props does kind of what you might think. It looks at the last props and the next one, figures out what's different, and then adds that to sort of like a queue of changes that we return. This is where you can start to see some of the logic here, right? Like there are some sort of assumptions that React, or some API things that React DOM has picked, right? Like style is an object, it's not a string. So we have to turn, we have to check if it's a style key and then turn that into something. I have a diff style up here, which does that. It's not all that interesting. Also check if the prop is dangerously set in or HTML and do something special there. But this is just sort of a collecting what things might be different. The actual work is done here in update props. So just looping through the key and the value. And if it's a style, we use this little helper, which is just setting CSS text, concatenating everything together and setting CSS text. If it's dangerously set inner HTML, we just go ahead and set the inner HTML. Children are weird. Generally, you avoid that because this is going to be called again.
Children are weird.
I mean that in both sense, both ways.
Pun intended.
Yeah. If it's an event, so if the prop starts with on, we need to do something special, and I'll get there. And then finally, sort of like the, okay, it's just a thing, set it on the element, which is set value on element. This is where you start seeing the ugliness. So React DOM has a similar sort of like file where all of this is like located, and it's like super worth reading if you have a chance or want to like have a better kind of appreciation for the amount of stuff that it's doing. I have tried to cut this for this project to the bare minimum necessary to just support HTML with sort of the last two browsers. So trying to maintain the same API as React DOM so that anything is drop-in compatible except for browser support. So I learned a ton of stuff just doing this, and I already a difference between React DOM and React DOM Lite here is that React DOM takes an attribute first approach. What that means is it will try and set, if you have a prop, it'll try and set that prop as an attribute before setting it as a property. So it'll use set attribute. So there's actually, I don't actually even understand why it does that necessarily, but well, it's safer in some ways. React DOM Lite takes kind of a different approach. So we try and do property. We set the property first if it exists, and then fall back to an attribute. The advantage to that is we need a lot less configuration because I don't need to know how to map a property to an attribute unless I like, there's a few cases. Things I learned though. There is the property list and type. So input.type, that exists in JavaScript, but you cannot set it. I mean, it won't do anything, won't error or anything. It's fine that you set it, but it will have no effect.
It's basically like a different.
Yeah. So you run into a lot of this stuff where it's like, what we do is what you would imagine. Like, okay, look, you have your element, check if the property exists in it. If it does, set it. Unless it's a list or a type. Just two. Just these two. And of course, if it's an SVG, you have to use the attribute. So then this is just if it's an SVG, we have to make sure we have the right namespace, and then this is the actual attribute setting code. The nice thing about using properties is that maps nicely because you have JavaScript values on each side, right? Like the prop value of, you can set input value of a number, right? It could be 2. The attribute, that's always a string, right? Like the value is always a string, but you can just set a number to input.value and it works fine. If you set an attribute, you have to set the right string value. This is particularly cool for, not cool, annoying or interesting for Boolean things. So you can start to see a lot of the logic is here is like, if the value of the prop is true or false, and it's a string Boolean value, then we actually need to set the value to the string representation of true or false. Otherwise, it needs to be a valueless, like just disabled, right? Like you want the flushed thing here to look like, in your HTML, it can't be disabled, or my favorite version of this is just disabled empty string or disabled.
Or true.
Yeah. So some of them have to be true. Where's my config? I have a list of some of them, I think. Where are they? Oh yeah. Content editable, draggable, spell check, value. Value is sort of the obvious one. Like if you set it to true, you want the value to be the string true, right? Like spell check. There are only 2 options. It's value, it's true and false, but it has to be a string true and a string false. Some of them accept a Boolean value and also the string value. So if you read the actual React DOM code, there's like a ton of different configuration logic around handling this. We're doing a lot less of it to try and figure out what sort of the minimum case is. Hopefully we push that back to React DOM.
This is like normalized CSS, but for
yeah, it's like the more you spend any amount of time in this, you actually you're like, oh, the DOM is a really terrible host target for React. like I think it only exists because it was the first one.
Yeah.
I wouldn't pick that normally. It's bad. There's not really in a language that has a declarative markup, it's not declarative. It's
Use XML.
yeah, there we go. That will definitely simplify it.
And if it's not, we can spread some more.
Yeah.
Soap. Yeah, I mean, around XML stuff, there's a ton of annoying little things where some attributes are namespace, but JSX doesn't support that. So you have to do where is it? Not even in here. Where'd it go? Oh yeah, here. So XML, these are all Xlink. Xlink is weird. Why? No one has ever used a different. This is the other annoying thing about this. You have to support this, but if you cannot find on the internet SVG code where the value of Xlink is different than this one thing.
Oh, God.
It doesn't exist anywhere, but you can set it, which would control the namespace you use for it's out of control. There's just some, yeah, like I said, fun ones like row span, col span, content editable. Just these kind of 4 are the main big ones where the attribute is just completely different. It's not this should be, the attribute should be row span, but it's not. So yeah, so this is sort of how, and React DOM has a ton more code, and you would be surprised how many little things there are around just this one thing. And React DOM does some even more fancy stuff where like it tries to sync the two values where it can. So like the value, like we talked about in the beginning, like value doesn't sync, but React makes sure that it updates the attribute for value as well as setting the property for value, which led to a really interesting issue where something was accidentally sending passwords to the server because they were not expecting the value of the tag to change. So it was just auto collecting input values. It was like an analytics, I forget the thing. It was just setting them all.
Is it faster, your version, in some measurable way, because you're not doing as much?
Well, because I haven't measured it, I can say yes.
By definition, it's doing less, so it's faster.
Yeah.
White is in the name. It's got to be.
Yeah. It should be faster, but like that stuff is super unintuitive, especially in this space. So like it could be slower. I don't know. That wouldn't surprise me if you told me that. I would never guess that it would be slower, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
The other sort of interesting bit, and then I'll shut up, that I think is worth talking about is the event system. So React uses has a bunch of hooks for mapping the host environment's event system to its own plugin-based synthetic event system. And what does that even mean? So this is how it works. I don't know how it works in React Native, but I know it does hook into the same system, right? Like
Yeah, it's the same event system.
yeah, I don't understand the native event systems, but I know that there are very large plugins for Responder and anyway, this is kind of how it works, interacts with in sort of the high level thing. React listens to the document, so just the document for all events. It does some amount of like pool, so it adds one handler at the top per event as it sees that you're listening to that event. So if anywhere in the tree you have an onChange event, it adds an onChange to the document. When it receives the native event, so all the way up at the document, it takes that event, finds the associated sort of component instance for the target of that event, and then it passes them through this like set of plugins, which really like function like middlewares, where they can say, I care about these top level events. I want onChange, on input, on selection change. And those come in, and what it does is it returns a set of essentially a bunch of events, a bunch of synthetic events. So you can either ignore some events or map and reduce them down, like the React onChange, DOM onChange event takes click events for radio and checkboxes, onChange events from file and select inputs, and on input events in browsers that support them, and turns it into one onChange event. After it has the event, React traverses down its own tree to the component in the sort of capture phase, and then it traverses back up. Along the way, calling any handlers if it sees props.onChange. So it'll go down and then up, just like the React, just like the DOM event system. You have your capturing and your bubbling phase. Some sort of differences. It seems very modeled after the DOM system in that it's like very close to it, but some difference are like all events bubble. So you may not have realized it, but you can attach like an onChange handler anywhere and you will pick up any onChange event from an input below there. No one talks about it because I think it's one of those things where you're like, I really wish we didn't do that. And also, I don't know that a lot of people know, if you take the event handler and append capture to it, you'll get the capture handler for that. So you can do onChange capture, and you'll get it on the capturing phase.
Can you reduce it or something, or mutate it at that point?
You could, but I don't think anyone would want you to.
What if you did like an open source comp bunny? You're like, oh yeah, comp bunny, and then you just like
just mutate them all.
You just control everyone.
Put this at the top. Yeah.
Very important that every site uses it.
React does like a ton of stuff that we're trying to figure out whether some of it is even needed anymore. Like the DOM does, where it pools event instances as it creates them. So there's only ever 10 instances of an event created at one time. It's unsure whether that's needed in browsers anymore. So this is how React DOM Lite handles it. I think it sort of maintains the spirit of it. The reason we're trying to even do this at all with like synthetic events versus just using the native DOM events is there's some nice advantages to having traversal happen through the React component tree itself. One thing is you get to have features like portals, where portals will actually bubble events through them. So even though those components, like if you have a drop down and its position fixed against the body, an event can bubble from that component up through to the thing that rendered the portal in the first case, which is cool. It also has caused some annoyance. But to do that, you need to have a purely sort of React-owned traversal model for each event. We have no plugins because I'm trying to keep it lean. But this is like really hard. Like, if anyone wants to spend some time with the most frustrating 200 lines of code ever written, look at the change event plugin in React DOM. It is the bane of my existence, and the source of premature aging. Because there's a ton of like to make a component where like the value is always the same and not screw up anything else in the DOM, where the assumption is that like that won't be the case. Like you need to handle an input. I need to turn its value back. If you've ever like taken an instance of an input and set the value on it, even if it's the same value, you'll notice that the cursor position will reset. So we need to do this on every key press and also keep the cursor position in the right spot. You need to handle cases where you notice that the browser autofilled and you report that back, or password managers, or so there's a ton of needing to interact with other stuff that might be on a page, and while also providing this like really like nice controlled input API. So this is my last little bit. When a handler is added, we attach a proxy handler on the capture phase. So this is document.add event listener. I'll pull it out. And the proxy handler will mark an event as handled when it catches something, and then we pass it through and walk up and down the tree. I am avoiding the actual React synthetic event system completely because it's big, but we're mimicking sort of the same behavior. So that begins with where if a prop is an event, we're going to say listen to it, right? So let me head into events. So this is a really terse version of what I think makes up the vast majority, not vast, the majority of React DOM, which is all the event code. Listen to. So what this does is we keep a map around a map of the element, and then so a weak map of the element that as its value is a map of the string or the event and its handler, right? So this would be my input, and then a map of on change, on input, on blur, and then the actual function. There's a nice thing about React is because of the way that like event handling works, you can actually only attach one listener at a time, right? Like JSX doesn't allow you to say, here are 4 functions to run, right? Like you have to manually compose those into a single function, which is nice. So this is, we look at the name that you passed in, if it was supporting the capture logic, right? Like if it was on change capture, then we need to call that during the capturing phase, otherwise during the bubbling phase. This is our one little thing because we have to. If the name is change, then we actually need to use the on input event, because React on change events fire per key press, not on blur like they do natively. So to support that, anyone who has on change or something is expecting that certain behavior. So what we do is we swap them out in that case. If it's change, I change it to an input event. But then if there's no value, which would be the handler, we remove the listener. If there is, I add this one handler proxy. And then I keep track of my my key. So this is the event name and the phase that it's bubbling at. So this is the actual thing that gets called. So this is the function in add event listener. So this is what's called when the event happens. We don't listen on the document. So the same event might fire more than one time. So if I'm listening on change in 2 different places, it could fire a bunch of times. So the first instance of it, I'm essentially tagging it, saying if it's not in this like weak set, like add it. And then so I know if I see this native event again to just ignore it because I'm already handling it. And then we create this synthetic event from the native event. And the synthetic event is this like really simple wrapper where we just add the React APIs. This is like purely for API compatibility. It doesn't do anything. Like persist doesn't do anything because I'm not pooling the event instances you get. You get your own. Everyone gets their own. But so it doesn't break anything. And I lost it. And then this is kind of where the magic happens. Dispatch, traverse, 2-phase. So this is a function. It's up here. Where this is what we do. This is all of the magic. Collect ancestors. So we take our instance and we walk all the way up the tree until you hit the root, and you just build an array of those. So that's from the top of the React tree all the way down to your particular instance. And then we just walk backwards for the capturing phase and then walk back up and run this callback on each ancestor of the thing as you go. That's all the way down here. It's also like pretty straightforward. This is where we have the element. So this is the actual target of the event. We check if it's in our set. So this was the thing where this would be in here if there was a prop with that event on this particular element, because we would have it. So if we have a handler, we essentially just call the handler. Like you just call the function, and then check if they've called stop propagation and like cancel out of it otherwise.
Do you have to build that that higher down stack every time an event is fired?
Yeah.
And that doesn't end up being like.
No, so React DOM does this with significantly more work. This was one of those things where I built this like as I was doing it. If you're not thinking about it, you think like that seems crazy. Why would you do it that way? But that React DOM does it. It does some amount of like optimization around, but like most of that is around memory management, like not building too many objects quickly.
Right.
The actual amount of work of like walking up and down the tree is not particularly. So I mean, you think of like how deep could it be? Like you're probably talking about at most 1,000 levels, right?
Even that would be pretty.
And that is a lot of of DOM elements. A loop over 1,000 elements is not gonna take any time. I had my sort of initial test with like mouse move, where it would have to do this like multiple times a second. Hasn't run into any issues. I was surprised. I was surprised. I thought like, oh wait, no, React DOM must do something different, and it doesn't. So that's about it. Hydration is the last little bit on there, but there's not much to that. Like what it is you get your tree and you have to compare it to some HTML element that already exists. And like there's not a lot of work. You attach event handlers if you need them, but like most of it is just sort of like checking. You're just checking if they're different, and if they're different, yelling. Yeah. Other than that, though, like you don't actually need to do anything because it goes kind of like it goes one way, right? Like React is saying what it should look like. You're just making sure that it looks that way. So that's it. Any questions? You can install this if you want. Working on it with one other guy.
How wide is React DOM?
It is half the size of React DOM. It probably supports half the browsers too. My like dream is that it is more mobile focused. I'd like to sort of like target it for reasonable set of mobile browsers. Yeah, there's like a ton of stuff that it doesn't do, but you might not know. Like I think for a lot of apps, you just might not notice. Like a lot of the React event code is around polyfilling event behavior. And I mean, it can be wildly different across browsers, but like you might not care. And sometimes that's easy to handle in your own, like in application code. Like, you know, like IE 11 does an odd thing where it fires an on-change handler every time you set the placeholder. Doesn't matter if the placeholder is visible. If you set the placeholder, you get an on-change event.
Yeah.
Like, so React DOM will do a thing where it dedupes calls, like on-change calls. So like if you get a native on-change call for one element more than once, you only get one event. I added that and I regretted it almost immediately. It took, I think, 2 years to get that PR in. And then
You've been working on this for a while.
this was my way in. It was 2 years of purgatory, and my reward for it was push access to the React repo.
It's like that joke about the dog that runs into the forest. How far can it run? Only halfway, because the other half is running.
It was fun how you're like, oh, I'm not going to talk about context. It doesn't do this. Oh, by the way, we need this whole sense of context for SVGs, and it's clearly a whole other concept. But
Yeah.
Very fun.
Yeah, cool.
So it's probably wildly impractical, but it's cool to like in the whole browser stuff. You could like somehow or another chunk out different pieces of like, you know, polyfilling and older browser type stuff, and then say, oh, you're targeting these browsers, and then just automatically like strip out.
I mean, I think there's a cool opportunity for it. Like I said, my goal here is that this is not like a pre-active drop-in replacement, like an actual drop-in replacement for React DOM if you have different needs. Something like if you're building a Gatsby site that is only targeting modern or you want mobile browsers, like you could save a ton of code.
Or you just say it's only doing content. Like all we're doing is rendering to the DOM, and there's no input handling. No,
right. Yeah. So like I don't need. You should like. Yeah. There is what I think is one of the more clever. It's also in the on-change thing. Sophie Alpert wrote the original thing, which implements on input in IE8 using like a bunch of like proprietary, like IE only events, like on property chain. It's like a master class of like DOM hacks. It's was some of my favorite. We've mostly removed it at this point, but yeah, like there's a non-significant amount of code for those cases, because just like it just always seems to be the thing that like the edge cases are where all of kind of like they add up over time, right? Like I love the idea of like I don't know how we do. I guess modules theoretically will give us an opportunity for that, right? Like where you could split out functionality. I thought about that with like SVG. Like what I have in here is a build flag you can set. Like if you're not like lots of sites, like if you're building a content site, you don't need SVG support probably. Maybe.
Yeah. You get dangerous because you're like, oh, I have an icon, and then
right, and then it doesn't work at all. But
yeah.
But like even in the little bit here, like a lot of the but we just need to do this is for SVG support. So if you didn't need SVG support, you wanted those font icons.
Or you're just dangerous. I mean, you could also like dangerous set animation or something. Because you're skip that.
Yeah, true. There's usually a way around it, but like, yeah. This has been a fun experiment in trying to figure out like, okay, you just throw everything and start over. What are the problems that actually exist still? Because it's always hard, especially on legacy code, not legacy, but mature code bases like React, where you have an enormous amount of people depending on the behavior, like removing anything that you think like, oh, I don't like it. You lose like the way that mouse enter and mouse leave is implemented in React DOM. Nobody understands. Nobody understands why it's the way that it is. It's the oddest polyfill I have ever seen for that event. And we have it. All of the browsers that React supports support native mouse enter and mouse leave. But like nobody wants to touch that. And I was a little more sort of like gung ho about it until I tried to change any of the event code, and like 12 browsers break. Like, why is anyone relying on this? But yeah, interesting. Thanks, Joe.
Cool.
That's all, folks.